Hey everyone, my name is Jack, and in this video I want to go over why a real estate investor might want to use an LLC to invest in real estate and how entities work in the first place. Before we go into any detail, I need to emphasize that this video should not be taken as legal advice, and if you need legal advice, please consult an attorney in your state that's licensed to practice law, and they can give you legal advice. This video hopefully can serve as a basis for some knowledge on entities if you don't have any already, and can be helpful for learning about them before you go consult with an attorney. So what is an entity? A legal entity is a legal fiction that allows someone to basically put a barrier around their business in a way that treats it almost like it's a separate person. You often hear the phrase, corporations are people too. This is partly the reason because they are treated as a separate, complete entity rather than an extension of a person. Now, the nuances with entities are different from state to state, as they are governed by state law predominantly rather than federal law. So be sure to check your local regulations and the local requirements for every type of entity and the differences between one state's entity and another's, since even the ones with the same name might actually be different when you look down at the nitty-gritty details. You may have noticed that many corporations, for example, are formed in Delaware. This is because Delaware has a more robust amount of case law and different regulations supporting it, and generally is considered a specialized jurisdiction that's useful for forming corporations. This is why you'll see a ton of large corporations that are conveniently Delaware corporations, even though they may be using their business in other states and may not even do business in Delaware at all, besides being incorporated there. Now, you certainly don't have to use a Delaware corporation for whatever business you're doing. It's just a common example, since every state offers its own entity benefits and its own type of case law, though often they are quite similar. LLCs, or limited liability companies, are a type of legal entity that offer a lot of flexibility and benefits compared to many of the other entities that are out there. It's kind of a hybrid between a partnership or a corporation. It's a hybrid between those two and offers a lot of the benefits of both. Their flexibility makes them pretty popular with investors, not only real estate investors, but other smaller businesses especially, since they're easy to form and offer a lot of flexibility in that formation. Corporations are typically a lot more expensive to form and come with a lot more regulations as well to keep up with, but are generally better for larger businesses that are trying to go public. But you can still go public with an LLC. We'll get into that in a second. LLCs offer what's called pass-through taxation. This means that the LLC is not taxed separately as a corporation is. You'll often hear about the double tax that comes with a C Corp. This means that there's a corporate taxation on profits, and then any distributions to the shareholders are taxed as income. So there's two forms of taxation that hit any of the income that comes through the company. With an LLC, this is generally not the case. While you can elect to have the double taxation if you want to make it more like a corporation, many people don't, and just take the pass-through taxation so that it goes right to your income tax rather than having to pay a corporate tax as well before that. But the greatest advantage of an LLC is in its name, limited liability. This means that the business's liability is the business's and not the shareholders or the members of that LLC. They are not liable for things that the business does generally. For example, typically, if your business is under an LLC and it's sued and the business loses the case, the winning party will only be able to take the business's assets, not your personal assets, even though you might be a shareholder or a member of that LLC. This means that generally, if you invest or run a business within an LLC, your personal assets should be safe in the event that the business fails. However, this is not always the case, and we'll get into veil piercing in a minute. Now, as I mentioned with corporations and going public, LLCs also offer the ability to sell shares. However, there is a host of regulation with any sort of share selling, so please be careful and consult a licensed attorney when you're considering selling shares of your LLC or any legal entity for that matter. The SEC will be very excited to levy a hefty fine if you do not follow their regulations, so be very careful with that. So how are LLCs formed? Typically, you go through the Secretary of State in whatever state you want to incorporate the business in. For an LLC, you'll have to submit something called the Articles of Organization, or the certificate as it's often called, and that will essentially serve as the founding document for the LLC. You'll also have to designate an authorized agent in that state who will be able to take what's called legal process in the event that your business is sued, so that there's a point of contact in whatever state that the business is incorporated in. So even if you don't live in the state, you will need to have someone there as an authorized agent. Thankfully, there's many businesses out here that specifically serve as authorized agents. Often attorneys do the same as well. Once you've filed the articles of organization and have your LLC formed, you should also form an operating agreement, which outlines how exactly the LLC will, operate in the event that you want to change things, or if someone wants to sell their share or anything like that. This is much like a C Corp's bylaws in that it explains exactly how the LLC will operate when it comes to things like meetings or if things change within the LLC. An operating agreement is especially important when you have multiple members within the LLC, or if you envision having multiple members in the future, as it will clarify things while the LLC is still new rather than trying to retroactively fix them, because that can get pretty messy, especially when there's a lot of money on the line. After you have all your documents filed with the state, you typically will have to pay an annual fee or do some sort of annual reporting of sorts to make sure that the LLC stays in good standing in perpetuity. Thankfully, over time, the fees for forming LLCs in many states have come down. In my state of Illinois, we've had our LLC fees dropped by many hundreds of dollars just in the past few years. It's still fairly expensive. It's a few $100 just to file, and also a couple $100 every year or so to keep it up to date. But each state should have pretty reasonable fees for keeping the LLC in order, but it's something to consider, as if you're using a small business, that might be a large chunk of your profits, especially in the early years, so it's something to keep in mind as well. Remember, a legal entity is like another person. You have to take care of it. If you don't take care of it, the state is not going to be happy about that, and they're going to usually have fines or will simply remove your LLC status, and it can certainly hurt you when it comes to piercing the corporate veil, as again, we'll get to shortly. You may be wondering, does an LLC make you legally untouchable? The short answer is sort of. Definitely not always, as there's plenty of things you need to look out for. One way an LLC can often get disregarded is if the actual member commits fraud or does some other criminal or civil action that is personally attributable to them rather than being able to attribute it to the business. So if you defraud your creditors, that creditor can typically come after both the business assets and your personal assets if those aren't enough. Another common way to pierce the corporate veil or to disregard the entity in its entirety is to commingle the business funds with your personal funds. Remember, the LLC is its own business entity. You're supposed to treat it separately as that separate entity. So if you're mixing it with your personal funds, a court will probably look at it as though it's just an extension of yourself, and therefore will let that other party get to your assets and not just the business assets. So when you have an LLC, you should have its own business bank account, and you shouldn't be using that bank account to pay for your own personal expenses directly. You should make sure that it's carefully separated to avoid this commingling problem that can lead to piercing the veil. If you fail to meet the filing fees or fail to keep minutes in some states, this can also be grounds to pierce the corporate veil in a lawsuit. So be sure to follow all state regulations and be very, very intentional and careful to make sure that an LLC is treated as a separate entity and not something that's just casually attached to yourself, since it's not going to work if you do it that way. Another note that's similar to veil piercing is that a common way for creditors to get around this limited liability aspect of an LLC is that if you take debt in the business name, they'll often require a personal guarantee by one of the members, if not all of the members, depending on how many you have. This means that in the event that you default on the loan, not only can they come after whatever the business asset is, in this case a piece of real estate, they can usually come after you personally as well to make up for any remaining balance. This also means that if you default, it will affect your credit as well and not just the business's credit. So keep that in mind when you're running an LLC, even with real estate. What's likely to happen is until you get to have a very big real estate business, which not everyone wants to do, you're probably going to have to personally guarantee a lot of your mortgages, which eliminates a lot of that benefit. However, it should still protect you from things that arise on the property. For example, if a tenant gets hurt because something happened at the property, they slipped and fell maybe, they shouldn't really be able to come after your personal assets as long as you keep everything separate and don't give them grounds to pierce the corporate veil. One thing that should be mentioned with all of this is that whether you use an LLC or not, you should always be properly insured when you're running a business, especially one that involves other people who could get hurt on your property. For a real estate business, if you want to look at it this way, The first line of defense you have when you're running the business is to make sure that you're keeping your properties maintained and are ideally picking quality tenants that qualify for whatever the property you're offering is. Your second line of defense is your lease. However, this lease can't violate state law, but it should offer some protection against certain liabilities. Your third line of defense will be your insurance, this being the property's insurance, your business insurance, and then if you have umbrella insurance on top of that. All sorts of types of insurance are out there for real estate investors, and all of them can be very useful for protecting yourself from a potential lawsuit. The final line of defense is your entity, the LLC that you might be using or whatever other entity it is. That is, if the tenant sues and successfully sues against your business and wins all of the business's assets to pay for the judgment, but still has some amount left over, that entity will protect you, assuming it's not pierced in any way and you're successfully maintaining it, and will protect you from that remaining liability. The final overarching line of defense is to always have a good attorney on hand that can help you to sort through some of these issues both before and after they happen. But as you can see, an LLC is only part of a well-balanced structure to protect yourself from liability when you're running a business. Ultimately, there's no way to completely protect yourself from liability. There is a lot of gray area in the courts. However, they are typically pretty lenient with making sure that an LLC is used for what it's supposed to be used for, and that's protecting business owners from personal liability. But if they think that the LLC is just an extension of yourself, that you're commingling funds, maybe you're not making the proper filings each year, they're probably going to ignore that LLC, so you have to be very careful with it if you're trying to rely on it. But that's why you have multiple lines of defense to rely on in the case that any of the others fail, as some of them will fail at times. That's why you have to have others to rely on as well. In conclusion, a limited liability company, or an LLC, is a great way to have added protection against the plenty of liability that will come with running a business, especially a real estate business where people's homes are on the line. LLCs are relatively cheap to set up compared to other entities, and they're very flexible as well in that they let you change the management structure to your needs. As I mentioned earlier, consult with a licensed attorney in your state if you want to form an entity, and make sure that you do it right with them and that you follow all state regulations whenever you're using any sort of entity, as they vary from state to state. I hope this video was helpful for learning about how an LLC works and how it can benefit a real estate investor. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like. If you have any questions, be sure to leave comments below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel as it helps the channel out a lot. I post new videos every single week. Until next time, take care.